This conference will now be recorded.
All right, again, welcome to week 3. Like I was saying before, we're going to be talking about the scraper. So I'm going to kind of show you guys some techniques as far as kind of getting that started and completed. Well, not so much completed. I'm going to leave a lot of that to you guys. And then as well as the pulley, which we'll kind of talk about a few things here with the pulley as far as like ID creation. So we'll be using mat IDs and some other techniques where we kind of leverage a little bit of Photoshop to kind of create the end result. So let's not waste any time. We've got a lot to cover here, so we'll just kind of go ahead and dive in. Now, one of the most important things here is to make sure that any changes you need to make to your UVs have been made at this point. You'll need these UVs to be in a final state before moving forward. In fact, I was just modifying these, so I need to give that a quick fix real quick. There we go. So again, just make sure you should have had feedback. So if you need to make any significant changes, just go ahead and do that. This is for the pulley as well, so you'll want to make sure those are completed. Otherwise, you'll run into a lot of difficulties if your UVs are not very well optimized. So we're just going to go ahead and start with the scraper. The only thing we really need to do with the scraper is just make sure it's kind of subdivided before we export, because if you look closely, you can see that the UVs aren't quite smooth. So if I hit 3, you'll notice that the UVs will average just like the polygon. So you can see how this edge is pulling in, and then this related edge is also pulling in. So what I'm going to do is simply just select this object, shift right click, and smooth. So we'll just go to the smooth options. I have it set to 2 subdivisions. Now, by default, the UV boundary smoothing is set to the Maya Catmull-Clark. This will give you something very similar to what the 3 key is doing. Now, the only difference between the 3 key and what I want to do is that the edges are not smoothing. So what I'm going to do is actually turn on preserve edges and corners. So now when I smooth this, it's actually going to smooth the edges as well. So if I click apply, you can see these have been updated and they're looking much, much better. So at this point, we can go ahead and export this object out and we'll get started. Export selection, and we'll just go ahead and put it in our workspace directory. So we have the painter folder. I'll create a new one, call this scraper, and we'll just call this scraper base or whatever you might recognize. And let's go ahead and start a new project, file new, select our file. So go navigate to it, online, painter, scraper, scraper base. Nothing else needs to really change here outside of the document resolution, so we'll turn that up to 2K and I'll click OK. And there we go. And again, as always, the first thing we should always do when starting a new project is bake our mesh maps. So these guys right here are really important. We need these in order to leverage any of the generators. So I'm going to just change the output size to 2048. You could technically leave all of these turned on and it would work. It would give you some errors as it wouldn't be able to produce the normal or the ID proper. So typically I just turn those off anyway. Everything else here can be generated without those maps, or without the required file, I should say. Now, I haven't changed the name of my material that was assigned in Maya, so right now my texture set is going to be named Lambert 6. So I noticed with a couple submissions that was indeed the case with some of the exports. So when you're exporting, it is pulling the texture set name if you set up the exporter to match ours. So we have to be cautious about that. We can either name the actual Lambert 6 here. So you can see we have Lambert 6. This is the base material it pulls from. So we can either name it here before we export, or what we should do is just simply name it here in our texture set list. So if we just called it scraper underscore material or just scraper or something you would recognize, this would be preferred. The benefit to this is that we don't have any naming conflicts when we start rendering. So when you export this out, you're going to get a bunch of textures. What we want to avoid is a bunch of Lambert 6 or Lambert 2 underscore whatever and having duplicate files. So if you have multiple objects assigned with that identical Lambert, that's where the problem can arise. So we want to avoid that. So our mesh maps have been baked. We have our world space, ambient occlusion, so on and so forth. So that's all good. I do have the reference here. Hopefully you guys were able to leverage that to your advantage. I really do like PureRef. I think it's a fantastic application. So again, have at it. Now, as far as what we're kind of looking for with the scraper blade, there's kind of a lot going on here, right? So being able to kind of pinpoint the major details and figuring out what needs to be done is going to be kind of key, right? So when you might initially look at this, you can be like, well, this is, it's kind of overwhelming. There's kind of a lot going on. But the idea here is we want to break it down to its simplest elements. So obviously the blade's kind of got some rust to it, and then the handle could be some type of plastic or composite. And then of course, all the little components are kind of variation of that rust, right? So we're going to build off those, right? Once we start adding those layers of complexity and really start thinking about kind of what's going on, for instance, like the little paint or this kind of bluish tint thing kind of going on, that's when we start kind of deep diving it a little bit more. So that's where the real troubleshooting begins. And I want you guys to treat it just like the book or just like the table, where these elements are almost completely separate of one another, right? So with the book, you had the leather, you had the cloth, and then you had the gold. But when it came to kind of adding that wear and tear for those specific elements, you started building within those groups. So hopefully that kind of makes sense of where I'm going with this. So first things first, let's just go ahead and get some base materials on there, all right? So I'm going to delete layer 1. It's empty anyway. There's no real need for it. And we're just going to search for rust. There's a couple choices here. I prefer the rust fine, but you could probably use the rust coarse if you like. I'm just going to stick with this one. Now, if I drag and drop it, it's going to apply it to the entire mesh, just like a fill layer would. Clearly, we don't necessarily want that to happen. So what we need to do is mask it. So excuse me, I'm going to go ahead and group this for the sake of organization, because I prefer to mask the group for more global detail, and then I'll do specific masks within to do specific effects. So I'll just group it. We'll call this blade group. Then we'll just right click, add a black mask. This layer is now hidden. And now if I add a paint layer to this specific layer, I can now paint where I want that particular rust to be visible. So yeah, again, painting it by hand would be real tedious. So I'm just going to go to our polygon fill, switch to UV mode, and currently it's set to white. So all I have to do is marquee those regions in UV space or in 3D space. So we can easily do that. So I'm just kind of clicking those isolated areas. Now, when you get back here, just be a little cautious. Depending on how you UV'd that, you might need to kind of click around. So you can see like right in there, I have to kind of click on that to kind of get it. And what could be happening is I might need to kind of get it from the inside so you can kind of see that. So if you're having difficulty selecting those regions, what you could do is actually, again, go to UV space here. So we go 2D, 3D view. Let me get this out of the way. So I know it's going to be one of these elements, either the top or bottom. So just kind of getting in there can be the trick that you might need to make that selection a little bit better. So it looks like this particular area got added. I don't necessarily want that. There we go. So I'm assuming these two are the bottom. Yep. And we're good. Oh, nope, I'm not. So you see how it kind of lit up here? Not that one. Okay, I see what it is. Bingo, there we go. So again, the ones you select will vary depending on where you've placed those shells. So it's really no big deal. You can just kind of see where I've assigned those. So let's go back to my 3D view here and hit M. So the rust has now been assigned. We can bring this back. Now clearly this rust is extremely saturated. It's very rich. When we compare it to the reference. So we can easily manipulate that, right? So if I go back to the rust material itself, click on the color swatch, I can use the eyedropper as a kind of a quick way to get into the realm of what I'm looking for. Now, depending on which pixel I happen to highlight, it can get relatively close, or I might still need to kind of tweak it thereafter. Now keep in mind, I tried my best when taking the reference images to avoid excessive highlights, but metallic objects tend to have it no matter what. So keep that in mind. What we could be seeing a little bit of is just kind of the highlights of the softbox in the reference. Now, I could still kind of manipulate this, make it a little bit brighter, maybe just up the saturation just a tad and get it within reason, right? Or if you want to go a little bit darker, you can do that as well. Somewhere around there will be good. Now, when it comes to kind of modifying the rust, right? So you can see for the most part, it feels pretty flat. It does have some decent roughness on there. If I kind of get this glancing angle, you can kind of see those highlights down here. Those are kind of nice. I like those. But I'm not seeing any like high frequency detail in the height, right? It's still looking pretty flat. Now, if I went down to the technical parameters and I took this height range and cranked it up to 1, this would allow us to see what kind of height it's producing. Now, in my opinion, that doesn't look too good. I mean, it's doing something, right? But it just doesn't look like what it should. So I'm just going to keep that quite low. I'm actually not going to produce my height frequency through that particular attribute. Now, what I'm going to show you is not really advanced per se, but it is something we haven't really talked about. We're going to use it a couple times tonight, so hopefully it'll click. We're going to talk about something called anchors. So these little anchor points are pretty cool. It allows me to capture information almost like a snapshot in time. So at any point, I can add an anchor to any existing material layer or material mask. So I can add an anchor to this black and white mask, or I can add an anchor to this particular material. Now, the cool thing with this is it allows me to reuse it in some way or some fashion. So for instance, if I add an anchor here, this information is now captured. If I go up here and create a new fill layer, I can now plug in that anchor, right? So if I click on any one of these buttons, right? So for instance, base color, and I have this tab now for anchors, I can load in base color. Well, not so much base color, but I'm loading in the anchor point, all right? So as soon as I load that in, I see exactly what you would expect to see, the base color. I've loaded in that texture. But check this out. We can take this a bit further. This anchor point has a reference channel. And this is the channel it's currently using on this layer. So right now it's referencing base color. Just assume that's what you wanted to use, right? I can change it. Maybe I want to just use the height. There's the height. Maybe the roughness. There's the roughness. Metallic. There is none. It's just black. Normal. Doesn't necessarily work. I don't even think it has a normal, so it pulls nothing. But here's the trick, right? I have a levels control on top of this as well, so I can kind of tweak this. All right, so we don't necessarily need to plug it in the color. That's not really doing anything for us here. But now I'm kind of using this as a way to manipulate this particular fill layer. So I don't necessarily need to plug it in color. What if I plugged it into height, right? So let's turn all of these channels off and plug it directly into height and just see what we get. Okay, not a whole lot, but then again, look at the reference channel it's using. It's using the height channel. Now we noticed when we used that height channel, there wasn't a whole lot going on. It was pretty flat anyway, right? Because we kept the value pretty low. Well, instead of using height, how about base color? Did you notice a difference? Take a look. If I change it back to height, see how flat it looks? Now I'm changing it to color. It's subtle, but that's really what I'm kind of looking for, right? Now what it's doing, it's creating height based off color, based off the color of the actual rust. And I can change it. I can manipulate the levels here. If I want to kind of push that intensity, I can do that. So I'm just clipping that range by adjusting the levels here. So if I want more or less, I can kind of adjust the levels of the anchor, which is essentially affecting, well, it's not affecting the rust. It's just reusing this information in clever ways. All right. So this is extremely powerful. So what I'm going to do is just kind of bring this fill layer down, and I'm going to rename this to rust height variation, right? Just to give me a little bit of that frequency. And again, the cool thing about anchors here is they dynamically update. So any changes I make to this rust will propagate through. So for instance, if I rotated this, everything updated. All my height information is updated up on this fill layer up here. If I offset, or if I scale, or if I do anything, it'll update. Now, if I adjusted the colors to the point where there's no value, then we might have a problem, right? Because if I just kind of removed all of the value, and let's just go pretty high. So you notice how the height is adjusting based off the value? Remember, on this particular layer, we're piping in base color. So if there is no color to work with, our range is lost. You can see that update on the levels here. I can still kind of bring it back, but if I keep adjusting that value to pure white and eliminate pretty much all the color, there's no information to work with. So this becomes a problem, okay? So we have to be considerate about that. It's a delicate balance. But I think once you understand the concepts of what an anchor can do, I think it unlocks so much potential. And we're going to use it again, so don't worry if you didn't get it the first time, but we're going to use it a little bit differently moving forward. All right. So let's just say we have like a base handle. Let's just go ahead and get a base blade. Let's get a base handle. All right. So let's just see what we have. Let's just search for maybe like a plastic. Now, if you don't know what type of plastic to use, you can just drag and drop and see what you get. So maybe I throw that on there. Probably not. This clearly is not going to work. I don't even know what that is, but yeah, that's not happening. The plastic I'm actually going to use is going to be this plastic grainy. I actually really like this one. Now you could probably use the plastic matte pure or even plastic PVC. I think these are great. They would work. You would still have to manipulate them, and I'm going to manipulate this one as well. It's just kind of, you know, I think this one has a certain level of texture to it that I really like. Now by default, it's pretty intense, right? So clearly this is not where we want to kind of stop at. So again, same idea. I'll group it, call this handle group, create a black mask, and I'm going to assign it specifically to the handle. So I'll just marquee that area, and I want to make sure to get these areas in here. So we'll just click there, get that guy and that guy. There we go. And that should do it. So going back to my paintbrush. Now, same idea. I could color pick this, but clearly this is quite dark. Now, I have a good rule. Well, it's not. It's kind of a rule I picked up a long time ago. This one thing is to just avoid going pure black. I'm not saying you can't go pure black, but the idea here is that nothing in life outside of perhaps a black hole is 100% pure black, much less 100% pure white when it comes to like texture painting. Now, even Vanta Black is a very, very dark material, but I think it's in your best interest to just not push it to an extreme like that. And granted, it is dark, right? I won't argue that. It is dark. And depending on how we light this, it's going to change how we perceive this. So this is also another good idea. It's like, okay, so how are we lighting this particular shot? So if I want to match these highlights, I need my materials to match the overall roughness. So let's just go ahead and kind of match that. So clearly this should have a much, much lower roughness. Maybe not zero, but maybe pretty low, right? Now the height frequency on this thing is pretty intense, but if you look closely, you'll notice there is no height. It's not even turned on. In fact, it's pulling all that information from the normal. In this case, I just want to be consistent. Most layers will use height, so I'm just going to disable the normal, right? And I'll turn the height back on. So this kind of pulls away some of that intensity as well. And that's fine by me. I think we can repeat this pattern quite a bit. So if I scroll up, I have my material selected. I'm going to scroll up, and I'm just going to repeat the UV scale quite a bit, actually. We'll go up to, I don't know, 4.5. Now it's got that kind of that truck bed lining. Now I still think this is quite intense, so I'm thinking we can definitely pull back on that. So if we look to our technical parameters here, we have a height range of 0.025, a height position. Adjusting the position in this case is not going to do anything, so we need to adjust the height range. So I'm just going to lower this to like 0.002. All right, maybe a little too low. We'll bring it back. 0.005. Just enough to get the light to play with it, right? So let's go ahead and take that roughness down a little bit further. So we're just going to make this thing quite wet. And we get something like that. To me, that's a good starting point. I can work with that. Actually, there's a little area I missed down in here. Let me get those added. So go back to my UV selection and attach. There we go. All right. So again, with the highlights, what we're reflecting is just as important when we're trying to match this. So if we go to our environment settings here, you can see the panorama we're using has, well, here, let's just adjust the opacity and the environment blur. You've seen this before. We're reflecting this outdoor environment, which isn't necessarily the best choice for this type of environment. This was kind of a light box in my dining area. So the light box had two soft white linings, if you will, on the left and right, and then a black backdrop on the back end. So we want to kind of find something similar, and I think, again, that Tomico works really well, or what you can use is something a little bit like these guys. These tend to work pretty well. So these are like those little studio setups. Just find one that you think that feels fitting. Drop it in there, and you'll see that those highlights do change. They're going to be a little bit more obvious as to what they are, just large light sources that are kind of reflecting off the surface now. So in this case, I'm just going to stick with this Tomico. I think this one works the best, in my opinion, because it's still related or relatable as far as an environment that it's reflecting. So I'll go ahead and kill the opacity. We don't necessarily need to see that, but hopefully that makes sense why we kind of do that. How are you marking selected or selecting individual parts again? Yes, I'm using the polygon fill, so Peter is correct. It's the fourth tool down, and then if you switch to UV mode, you can just marquee, and it's just converting your selection to the UV shell. All right, so let's begin adding some wear. So if we look at this handle, clearly my roughness does not match. I mean, look at this thing. This thing is beaten up beyond belief. So this is where we can start to get a little bit more focused, right? So these are probably the two main folders you're going to work with. So I have the handle group and then the blade group. Now within that, I can still have subfolders, right? So maybe one for the paint, maybe one for different colors of paint. Or even one for the blue tint down here. So there's a lot of elements we can kind of separate, but still keep within specific areas. So let's just start with some roughness variation. So I'm just going to start building up the base handle. I'm not going to worry about paint. I'm not going to worry about anything like that. I'm just focusing on, let's say, scratches and imperfections on the handle itself. And then we'll kind of evolve into the paint and so on. So my preferred method for this is just using fill layers. So again, this fourth icon up here, it's just a blank material, like a blank canvas, if you will. It comes in with all these properties pre-enabled: color, height, roughness, metal, and normal. Now, if I'm just trying to create some roughness variation, I don't necessarily need these layers enabled. Now, it is on top of the plastic grainy, so any changes I make covers the layer beneath it, right? This could be good, this could be bad, but right now it's bad because we're kind of losing any of that appeal that we had as far as variation. So if I hit C to kind of cycle through it, my base roughness from this plastic grainy, I currently have fill layer 1 turned off. You can see there's some variation in that. Variation is good. We want variation. We want to avoid things like this, where when I add a uniform fill layer, I get a uniform result, right? No change. Outside of just a single color, that's all it is. but I can still modify this, right? I could technically plug a texture in here, but my preferred method is to actually plug it into the mask, and I'll show you why. I'm going to add a black mask. I'm hiding fill layer 1. There isn't really much going on in there anyway. And on the fill layer, the mask, I'm going to add another fill. And here's where I'm going to plug in my grunge or my texture. So if I go to my grunges, I feel a lot of these kind of grayscale ranged ones tend to work really well. If you use something that's a much higher contrast, it might require some further tweaking. So like these guys up here might be a little too intense. That could work really well. That could work really well. In this case, I'm going to use grunge dirt scratchy. I'm just going to drag and drop that onto the grayscale. Right now, if we look at this, it's working. We're getting a result, right? And depending on the value of the roughness here on the material, that fill layer, I may or may not see it, right? So if I make it very wet, it's pretty much not even there. It's working, right? But it's just blending with the layer beneath it to the point where you don't really see it. So you have to understand how these masks work. Right? So white always represents that particular layer will be visible. If it's black, that layer is not visible and we see the layer beneath it. Well, in this case, nothing is black, but we still see the layer beneath it because it's partially white. It's not 100% white. So it's almost like an opacity on top where we're just kind of taking that effect. So I can prove this. If I go to our roughness layer and I start tweaking this, if I increase this roughness, this handle will get brighter. We're looking at roughness, so overall value will get brighter, but it's going to be based off this mask, right? So these areas will get brighter the fastest. Everything else will get brighter, but these areas will get brighter faster. So let's take a look at that. So I'll go back to my roughness and I'll start to increase it. See how everything gets brighter, but this area got brighter faster? Again, that's how that mask works. So this is what's giving me that controls, because now I can kind of dictate how I want to kind of bring that in. So maybe I want to kind of keep it pretty subtle, but maybe I want to add some additional, right? Maybe just one's just not going to be enough. In this case, no, it's not. But this is still better than what we had before. So I'm going to just copy and paste, Command C, Command V. Now I have a duplicate layer with a duplicate mask right on top. So let's change it. I'm going to swap out that grunge dirt scratchy for something else entirely. How about grunge leak? Drag and drop, right? I can still tweak the overall roughness. Maybe I want more or maybe I want less. Or maybe in the same range. Doesn't really matter. You can see it's similar, but it's different. Now you get these lines. And if you ever have difficulty deciding what's kind of going on, just toggle them on and off. So for instance, maybe this fill layer 1, the first one we created, so we'll call this roughness var 1 for roughness variation. This one could be called roughness var 2. So if we go back to this one, maybe I want to repeat it a bit more because maybe that scale is a little too large for me, so I can go up and just start repeating it. Now it helps to make sure I'm scaling the right thing. So I'm scaling the actual material. Well, the material is already perfectly infinite because it's just this. All our modifications, all the variants in the look come from the mask. So I need to adjust the actual mask. So let me up the scale here and you'll see that kind of update. Right, so it's a pretty subtle effect, but it's these layers as I add and add and add, that's going to give it all that life. So again, if I look at my roughness and I just go back to where we started with this. I added this, and then I added this on top. So it's just these little additions that are going to give it that little bit of wear and tear, give it that life. And maybe I do a third or a fourth and fifth, or who knows, you can go as many as you need to get the end result you're looking for. Right? Just avoid going to 100% roughness. That's going to be pretty extreme. I don't think it's really doing that in the handle. You can see the highlights are quite tight overall, especially when you see that the glancing angles down here, right? It's still quite reflective. Yes, it's beaten up. Yes, it's all kind of haggard, right? So let's go ahead and group these roughness variations. We'll call this roughness group. Right? Then we can collapse that. We don't have to worry about that for right now. Let's do the same Methodology for the height. Again, creating a fill layer, turning off everything but height. Create a black mask and add a fill. So if I wanted to create, say, a level of scratches or kind of high frequency noise in here, I can kind of do that as well. So let's see if we can find some scratches. Now, there is a scratch generator here. Actually, I think they removed it. So some of these are going to work better than others. So like here's grunge scratch dirty. So we can just plug that in there and see what that looks like. Let me go ahead and change the height a little bit so we can kind of see it. Now you can see this is probably not the best result because I don't really see, like, it feels more like fiberglass, if you will, as opposed to like a level of high frequency scratches. Now we could probably adjust this, maybe up the contrast, but I'm definitely not feeling that. So the one that works pretty well in this regard is actually going to be this grunge scratch rough, mostly because I actually do think the contrast in this one works really well. Let me add that fill back, drop that on there. Now by default, this thing is going to be massive, and then it looks like my height is facing the wrong way, so I'll actually push those in. Now again, subtlety is key. Don't crank it to 11, right? That's going to look really bad. Just a little bit. And then if you think that is good, then you probably need to, well, if you get this, then yeah, that's looking pretty good. But I'm going to say if you think like even this is kind of a good range, pull it back some more, right? So if you, even if you think it's right, you might need to still pull it back just a little bit more. So I'm like 0.02 as far as my height. Now keep in mind it's based off values. So since we're working very binary, black and white, 2 is the maximum it's going to push. Now we can still adjust this. We have some settings here. On the grunge scratch rough. I can change the scratch quantity. There's a couple settings down here that I usually kind of immediately change. The scratch spots intensity, I'll kind of disable. So that's basically these little spots that kind of pop up. I just want the scratches. Similar with the dust, I kind of get rid of that. We do have a scratch tiling that I'll kind of turn up. And now the problem is if you go really high, you might start to see a lot of repetition. In this case, I'm not, so that could work out pretty good in my favor. Right, so I'm kind of liking that. Now I kind of want more scratches. So I can't really just repeat it here. This is where that tiling is going to come very obvious. Let me go ahead. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn on color so you can see it a bit better. Actually, I might not. Okay, so if I take the scale here and repeat it, do you see the repetition? Like you can feel it. No, not just feel it, you can see it, right? So we've got to be cautious about that. We don't want our scratches to look. Now, sometimes you have a little bit of headroom to kind of tweak it a little past 1. If you do, go with it, right? You can see the repetition here, right? You can see that major line here, major line here, major line here, and it's just going to work all its way down. Maybe try rotating the texture, find a way to break it up visually, right? Or maybe introduce some scratch masking, which drops out a few scratches here and there and kind of helps with the visual breakup. A better trick yet is to just simply copy and paste this layer. So now I have 2 identical scratches, but if I click on this particular scratch rough, we have something called seed. So if I just change the seed, I'll turn this layer off. If I change the seed, I can get a completely different look. It's just changing the value that kind of gets piped into the formula to create this. So if you were to type in this exact same value with all the exact same settings down here, you would get this exact same result with your particular scraper handle. Now that's to say if your UVs are in the exact same spot as well, which is probably highly unlikely. But again, I just need height, so I can turn the color back off. And maybe since I have 2, I can maybe just push this one a little bit further, right? Just a little bit. So some scratches are a little bit stronger than the others. Hopefully this makes sense so far. But now we're starting to get kind of a really scratched up handle. And again, when the light plays off it, you'll see it a bit more. So constantly move your light around. That's going to be key. We'll group that. We'll call that height group. All right, so let's say we're happy with the handle. Obviously, I think we could take this a lot further. In fact, even with the height, perhaps we take this a bit further already. So I'm going to create another fill layer. So there's a little vertical line that runs down the side of the handle, if you see right here. So we can actually create that same idea, right? So color, roughness, metal, normal, all turned off, and I'm going to push it in a little bit. And we'll actually name this for the sake of organization. We'll call this handle seam, create a black mask. And then I'll just add a paint layer, right? And with this paint layer, I'm just going to get a really small brush, maybe up the hardness a little bit, maybe around 0.8. And what I'm going to do is simply just click and drag, hold shift, click, drag. So click once, hold shift, click at the other side. And now I'm drawing that line in there. Now I'm thinking that's a little large, so we'll undo that. I'm going to make this brush a bit smaller, and we'll do it again. So click once, shift, and click the other side, and we get something like that. So that's looking pretty good. Do the same on the other side. This can be a bit difficult to see, so sometimes just hitting C to look at specific layers can help. Now I won't see the end result on the roughness, but it helps me draw the line. It helps me draw the line. So, and now if you were thinking about this artistically, the scratches and all of that probably wouldn't land in those specific areas. So I could still kind of control these elements. So for instance, maybe the roughness is really high in those specific areas. Or maybe, I mean, any number of things, like I can make them darker. I don't necessarily know if I would do it that way. I think it's gonna be pretty subtle either way. I might just stick with the height. And I think more importantly, it's getting this kind of paint transition. I think that's the more visually interesting element there to kind of create. So that's looking pretty good so far. So let's go ahead and group all of this, right? So plastic, grainy, all the way to these two groups here, and we'll just call that plastic base. We can collapse that, right? So again, if I need to start exploring the complexities of this particular material, I can just kind of expand these particular elements as opposed to worrying about a huge layer stack. Because if we understand this, the way this is working, everything I need to change for the base handle is just within this folder. So if I'm making paint now, let's just make some paint. So again, I could either start with material or I can make my own. So if I just wanted to add a fill layer and kind of modify it, I could do that as well. But in this case, I think I will use a pre-built material. I'll just search for paint. Now there isn't a whole lot of options. We have steel paint. There's some other ones on here, but these are smart materials. You could use those if you wanted, but I'm going to just stick with the steel paint and just drag and drop. Now by default, this is kind of what we get. So I could, again, color pick this. So we'll do that. Get this kind of off-white there. So again, look, even though this is pretty close to white, it's not even close to 100% white, right? So this is giving me some nice color variation. Now I'm just going to drag and drop this right into my handle group. So that's immediately isolated to that specific area, which is very nice. I'll group it and I'll call this paint group. And what I can do is I can either create masks here or I can create masks here. Now, depending on how you want to tackle this, it could work either way. I'm thinking it's going to be easier within the group to mask it because what I want to do is have a couple paint variations. So I have like this kind of off color. So if I copy and paste this, maybe I have this nasty kind of color here. Maybe there's like a bluish tint in there as well. Something like that. So if I copied and pasted that, I can create that kind of color there. And again, you know, spend a little bit more time with that. And so the trick here is now I can create black masks for each one of these, right? And then just paint where I want them to be visible. So how can we paint something that feels and looks organic? So if you were to use like a brush, so for instance, some of these alphas work, they work okay, right? I'm going to start with this whitish tan cream colored steel paint. I'm going to add a paint layer. So we're going to just see if we can paint something on there to feel natural. So I have a standard brush right now, and let's just kind of look through some of these. So we have, I don't know, this guy here. I'm just going to double click on it, make the brush a little bit bigger, and stamp. Okay, stamp again, right? So this is kind of the first problem, right? We need to fill out a lot of this handle, right? There's kind of a lot going on here. Well, that's the back side. This is the front side, the one we're working on. So you can see there's kind of a lot here. So, I mean, if I wanted to like drag, we're going to get a lot of repetition. This is going to look very, very poor. Now you could adjust your size and flow and angle and positional jitters, but then again, it's still going to be the same pattern stamping multiple times. Now, you could stamp once, find another pattern, stamp twice, and so on and so forth, and that could work, but that, you know, in my opinion, it's not always the best, and you're kind of limited based off the alphas provided to you, right? So it's kind of a delicate balancing act if you want to go that route. And there's nothing wrong with going that route. If you wanted to, you could. Some of these are probably going to work better than others, right? So experiment. The idea is we still want kind of a nice organic shape that has some contrast, but maybe fades off a little in certain areas. So I'm going to show you my preferred technique. All right. So one method I use is taking a grunge, right? Something that looks like paint splatter. So a lot of these, even this particular element here could work really well. So let's see. I'm going to try this one. We'll try something different this month. And what I'm going to do, instead of plugging it into the alpha, I'm just going to remove that. I'm going to put that basic brush back in there. See if we can find it. Basic brush. That's not it. Basic soft, so it's loaded into my alpha. We'll go back to our paint layer and we'll find that grunge again. I think it was this one. Yeah, let's try it. So I'm going to take this and load it into my stencil. So now that's in the stencil, I can pick areas that I like to kind of position. I can scale them up, I can rotate it, and I can just paint it in. So once I'm satisfied with like the overall position, I just start painting in the color I want. So right now the color is pure white, but it's based off the stencil. Since there's grayscale in the stencil, I'm not going to get a solid, opaque, high contrast color. So check this out. If I just start painting, you'll see what that's going to do, right? So that kind of works, but you can see I'm pulling in a lot of this excess detail from out here. Now I can still adjust this. So if I start upping the contrast, maybe on the stencil here, maybe up in the balance, I can kind of eliminate that problem. So again, if I paint, now we get it in just where that area is. And if I need to kind of clean it up, I can remove the stencil and say maybe zoom in and start removing some of the excess here. So let me go ahead and up the hardness of this brush here. So maybe I'm not happy with this particular area, or maybe over here. Who knows, right? You're the artist. You're the artist. It might be hard to believe it, but you are artists. You are all artists now. So deal with it. So we have that kind of assigned. We can still adjust the material, so it does have its own kind of unique height parameters. So maybe we give it a little bit more range or slightly adjust the position a little bit so it comes up off the surface. I think it's quite flush with the surface, so I wouldn't really crank it up all that high. It's going to look kind of chunky anyway. So now we could play with the roughness of this for sure. Maybe it's dry, so maybe we kind of up that roughness quite a bit. And so when the light plays off it, you get it kind of a different look, right? So you can kind of see the highlights kind of break up across that surface. And we could do this for each particular layer. So maybe with the blue layer, I add another paint layer, and we do the same thing. We find a different grunge map. So maybe something with some spots. I'm not feeling that one. That could work. Let's try that one. Throw that into the stencil. And I'll up the contrast a little bit because, again, I don't want to pull some of that background information. And maybe I just kind of paint in very specific areas. So right now I'm painting in black, so I want to paint in white. Let me get something like that. And then I can just move it around. maybe paint a different section, maybe just a little bit of blue highlight there. I can move the camera completely around, paint that in right there. Who knows, right? You can have a lot of fun with this and still create some very organic shapes very, very quickly. So let's increase my balance here, and I'm just going to paint that in. That's looking nice. I want you to have your Bob Ross moment with this handle. Happy mistakes all over the place. Let's go back to maybe this dark brown, add a paint layer, and swap it out for something entirely different. Some will work better than others. So again, like maybe if I use these spots, you can see it's got a lot of frequency to it, but I don't think this is going to look the best. Actually, it doesn't look too bad, but if I were to put spots across the whole thing, I don't think it's going to look so good. So I think it's finding a good texture in combination with kind of blending it in is kind of key here. So maybe this one would work a little bit better because I kind of like the shape of some of these spots, if that makes any sense. So we'll up the contrast a little bit, up the balance, and now I can, again, paint in some of those brownish spots on there and just kind of overlap it, you know, who knows? All right, let's do one more. And again, you know, add additional paint layers. You don't have to do it all in one paint layer. There's another one that works really good. It's kind of a Grunge Map 004. This one has some nice kind of unique patterns if you want some larger splotches to it. The only problem I have with this one is how flat the colors end up looking. So it tends to look a little kind of weird. Now be careful with your stencils, right? Because if you project at this weird angle here, I'll just show you. It's going to do it. And then when you move your camera, you see how it's like skewed, right? Just stretched across that surface. So be tactful with how you kind of position this. So now if I paint in some white here, we can do that, and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and get rid of that stencil and kind of get something like that. Now, clearly, spend some more time on that. Right, I'm just kind of showing the premise of what you can kind of do. I'm thinking there's a lot more thickness and volume to the paint, but I definitely like how this is kind of starting to look. I love these little kind of smaller areas. I'm not too sold on this particular area. I think the blue is kind of a nice touch, but maybe smaller and more selective. The stencils have won your heart. Good. And again, you can use paint layers, you can use stencils, you can use fill layers, whatever you want to use to get the job done. I don't care. Right? It's all fair game. I only care about the end result, how you get there, right? All right, so now's where if we wanted to get a little bit more selective, so for instance, like on the side of the handle, you can see how the paint kind of wears away, right? It doesn't like jump ship to the other side. So we could just paint in black and remove those specific areas. So it does take a little kind of finessing to figure out where we need to remove it. So turning on and off those specific layers will help us diagnose that. I'm just painting in black and then removing that area. So I'm just holding shift and getting something like that. So I can create that illusion of that transition, right? Cool. And this process is pretty much the exact same process I would do for the blade, right? This bluish tint and the chipped paint, or if you want to call it chipped paint, is 100% how I would do it, is how I'm doing it on the handle. All right, no different. All right, let's talk about the hide logo, how we can get that in there. And we'll kind of jump over to the pulley. So a lot of the techniques we're going to do will work in both. Now, you'll definitely have to spend some significant time with these two assets. It's going to take time, right? I estimate at least 20 hours. So don't wait to the last minute to get these guys done, all right? There's a high level of fidelity we're kind of looking for. Let me go ahead and collapse that paint group. So this is the logo. So sometimes you're fortunate enough to be able to read the actual logo. In this case, it's the hide logo. So if I were to like Google search this, hide logo, you might just get lucky, right? And find the actual logo. So if I search for it, there it is. But this is a 250 by 250, quite small, oh, excuse me, quite small. So we need something that's a little bit larger resolution. So let's just go ahead and go up to our tools here, size, and do something large. Hide photography is probably not what we're looking for. There it is. Look at that, 1800 by 441. Right? So we can grab this particular logo. Now this has some problems. If we think about it, if we look closely, you can tell this isn't pure, right? So if we were to imagine we're applying this as a mask, the text would be raised or colored, and then everything outside the circle would also receive the same effect. But since this isn't pure black, we'd get part of that result in those areas. So let's just go ahead, right click, view image, and then save this to the desktop. Right, so we're going to have to make some modifications. We'll save it to our painter folder for the sake of organization so we can find it. And let's go to Photoshop. Now you could do this all in Painter. I find that Photoshop is definitely better built for certain things, and this is one of those elements, right? There it is in all its glory. I already had it open, imagine that, but this will work just fine. So first things first, we want to kind of fix the dimensions. Now, if we were to bring this in as is, if you were to plug it into a stencil, it would work just fine. If you were to plug it into a fill layer or a brush, you're going to run into some issues. What it's going to do is immediately try to make this square. So if I were to adjust the image size here, and let's do 441. Oh, hold on. Let's not even, we'll unlink that. Hold on. Let's image size, pixels. Give me pixels. It's going to do that, right? It's going to squash your result, and you're going to be like, what the heck? This is terrible. So clearly we don't want to squash it. So we're going to adjust the dimensions beforehand. So I'm just going to go to image, canvas size, and match the longest pixel length. So whether it's taller than it is wide or wider than it is tall, I'm just going to match the longest side with the other. Get something like that. All right, so now it's square for sure, and we're good to go. I don't know what your comfort level is in Photoshop. Hopefully you guys have had a little bit of experience in there, but everything we do tonight is going to be pretty simple. I'm just going to use a levels to kind of remap the color. So first things first, I want to make sure my blacks are black and my whites are white. So I'm going to add an adjustment layer. Clicking on this fourth icon down here, I can add a levels. Now, I don't know if you guys know how to read a histogram, but a histogram basically allows me to see the range of information and where it kind of pretty much lies. So this is the actual dark values. You can see they're not pure black. Here are the white values. You can see even those aren't pure 100% white. So we have a black point, a white point, a gamma, lift, and gain. We're going to predominantly be using black and white points. So as I increase the black point, I'm going to be changing the threshold in which this goes pure black. So if I can get this beyond this peak, everything in that region is black. And we could test this. If I open up our infograph here and I drop this, you can see that this particular area is about 46, right? 46 in value. So let's go ahead and bring this up. And now if I look, you can see the modified one on the right there is 0. All of it is 0. So that's good. I'm going to go ahead and do the same for the white point. Now, I don't want to crank this all the way. This is where things start to get a little weird. And you'll see this effect in Painter as well. When you crank your levels too hard, you start to get that aliasing artifact, right? So if I crank it all the way, it's turning to basically a binary texture. So again, we don't want to do that. Little, in this case, will go a long way. Next, we just want to eliminate everything but the text. So I watched a student do this the other day. I thought it was amusing. He basically started doing this. And again, there's nothing wrong with this. You could do it. It's going to take you a while. There are easier ways. We're going to use the magic wand, right, to basically select everything that is white. And then I'm going to hit Option Delete to flood the canvas or my selected area with black. So it's basically filling it with the foreground color. Right? And then I'm just going to simply remove this little bit of excess by hand Now I could have expanded my selection by a couple pixels and kind of eliminated altogether, but I think that's adding complexity where none is needed. And we'll just kind of erase the rest of that. Do that again. I kind of clip the edge of that H, and we get something like that. So all is good. We'll go ahead and save this out. Now, the best thing about using a pre-made logo, right? Check out all the intricacies. There's like a little arrow in the Y, the way the text is connected. You don't get that unless you make it yourself, right? If you're just use the font tool, you're not going to get it. So sometimes it is in your best interest to leverage this. We'll save it out, Painter, make sure we go to the correct one here. That's Campus, Online, Painter, Scraper, and again, I will save as a PNG. So don't save as a JPEG. We don't want to introduce any more compression than we have to. And click OK. All right, back to Painter. Let's go ahead and import that asset. So clicking this icon will allow us to import a resource, add resource, and there's our logo. Currently it's undefined. I'm just going to say it's an alpha. You could do it as a texture as well. It really doesn't matter. It's just where it kind of gets filtered down here. And we're going to say hide. So this is going to allow us to search for it on those that particular text. And I'm just going to do it in this current session. Click import. So there it is. If I double click it, it'll add it to the brush, and that's perfectly acceptable. We can stamp it on there however we like. So if I hit X, I can invert my colors. And let's just kind of make that a bit bigger. So you could do this in 2D space or 3D space, whatever you find easier. So if I did in 2D space, I could probably better stamp this, right? So again, use your reference. I'm just going to kind of ballpark it. And I'm going to, well, first off, let's create a new fill layer so we're not just stamping it to some random thing here. Like, what did we do? I don't even know. So I'm going to create, excuse me, a new fill layer, okay? So on that fill layer, I'll just do that, and I'll do it above the paint and plastic, create a black mask, and I'll add a paint to that, and then we'll just stamp it in there somewhere around, let's do very precise here. Yeah, that feels pretty good. We'll go with that. A little off, but I think you get the idea. So again, if we were thinking about this, yeah, it probably pushes in a little bit, if anything. In fact, I'm just going to say it does. So I'll turn off color, roughness, metal, normal, and just kind of push it in, right? So we get that hide logo, right? But we kind of hit this first issue. I really want the text to kind of interact with the paint in some way, right? But I'm not quite getting that. So how could we do that? Now I could subtract this particular result from the paint, and yeah, that would work, but now I have to kind of figure out how to stamp this back in the exact same spot to make sure I'm subtracting from the exact same area. And I could like copy and paste this, but now I have to figure out how I'm going to add that to that particular mask. Yeah, now we've got a problem. So this is where anchors come back, right? So I'm going to just take this fill layer 2 and bring it all the way down to the bottom. And there's a reason for this. Anchors cannot be used. So like when I assign the anchor, I cannot use them below the layer it's created. So if it's up here, right, above the paint, and I create the anchor up here, I can't use it in the paint group. So I like to put my anchors down at the bottom. And I'm just going to call this hide logo. It's not in any group, just hanging out at the bottom. In fact, I'm going to just turn off all the material properties, right? This thing is contributing nothing. And I'm just going to anchor this alpha, right? So right now it has a paint layer. I've stamped the hide logo, and I'm going to right click, add an anchor point. Okay, cool. Now let's do something with it. I'm going to go back up to my plastic base. I'm going to go to my height group, right? This makes sense where I want to put it, the height of the hide logo. I'll add another fill layer, create a black mask, grayscale, whoops, yeah, add a fill on the mask. Anchor point, there's our hide logo, drop that in there, it's working. But I just want to affect height, so we'll do that again, and then I'll push the height down. And again, don't go to 11, a little will go a long way. All right, so it's there. Let's see about having it interact with the paint now. So I'll collapse that group, collapse the plastic, open up the paint. Now I have a couple things going on. Since I have multiple paint layers and I wanted to kind of affect each one, I could do it specifically for each layer. I'm going to do this up here, but we're going to work it backwards. I'm actually going to add a white mask to the paint group, because if I start with a black mask, you can already see the problem. I just lost everything, right? All the paint is gone because now this group is overriding all the subgroups. I don't want to do that. All of that information is being created by these, so I'm just going to say white mask to start with, and then I'm going to add a paint and subtract, not a paint, I'm sorry, add a fill, and that fill is set to do something, right? So let's go ahead and drop in our hide logo. So it's kind of working, right? Not quite. So what we can do here is we could actually invert it. So if you think about it, what is that hide logo doing? White to black. We want the paint to be outside of the logo. So we could invert it, right? We get something like that. So now the hide logo is interacting now. This is not exactly what we're looking for, but it's a start. It's a start. So let's take a look at this. It's actually a stroke, like a stroke outline, right? It's not just a full cut out of the logo. It's just a nice little line. We can do that. Now you could go back to Photoshop and you can make that if you're savvy, right? You don't even have to be that savvy. You can do it. I'm going to show you how you can do it here in Painter, right? So this is going to get a little crazy. I'm going to go back down to my anchor system down here. So nothing I'm going to change, or I'm not going to change these two existing layers. I'm going to add something called a filter. So we haven't explored these too much, but filters are just additional processes where we can do specific tasks. So for one, I'll add a filter and I'm going to do a blur. It's going to do exactly what you think it's going to do, blur it. All right. I'm using this blur to create grayscale. I want some information. So I'm going from black, grayscale to white. All right. I'm going to use another filter. And we're going to use something called gradient. And it's this kind of black and white checker with the red on it. We'll plug that in. Now, by default, we're not going to really see much of a change. What this particular filter allows us to do is remap black, grayscale, and white values to different colors. All right. So color 1 is our blacks. It's being remapped to black. Color 2 is our grayscales, which is being remapped to gray. And color 3 is our whites, being remapped to white. So what if I did this? What if I remap the white point to black and the grays to white? Now I have a stroke outline. And I can adjust this even further. I can add a levels on top and start to clip that range. So right now you can kind of see it's kind of beveled, if you will. Maybe I want to kind of tighten that up a little bit using levels. And now if I anchor this, I can say logo stroke. So now I have an anchor. So this anchor is capturing everything below it, which is just the paint layer. And this anchor is capturing all below that, which is the levels, gradient, blur, and paint. It doesn't really care about that particular anchor. And so now if I go back up to my paint group and I grab that stroke, you can see I need to kind of fix it now. It's doing the opposite. So we'll invert it again. Check that out. Now it's removing it from those particular areas. So that's going to help with the readability of your text quite a bit. Any questions on that? It's a bit much. It's intense, right? But it's extremely powerful, especially if you can get comfortable with it. All right. Now we can take this even further, right? So again, keep in mind, any changes I make down here will propagate. So if I go back to my levels, so if we just look at the mask, if I alt click, this is a good way to kind of visualize what we're doing, right? I'm alt, when I say alt, I mean option. Option click on your mask allows us to visualize it. So all the changes up to this point. So if I work backwards, I can kind of see what this anchor sees, right? But if I want to see what this anchor sees, I'll just start turning these back on. I get that result. Maybe I want to create some visual breakup because right now this is just a pure subtraction of the result. Let's click on that levels and add a fill. And then maybe we drop in some type of random grunge. I have no clue. Let's do grunge leaks thing here. And I'm going to just straight up subtract it because right now it's set up on top. So I could either subtract or I could multiply. And let me bust up the balance here. And you can see what that's kind of doing. Let's get some more contrast. And now what I'm going to get is a little bit more visual breakup on that text. Got to find that sweet spot. Now if I hit M, you'll notice the paint comes in some areas, but it's still removed in others. So that's kind of the idea there. So it's not a perfect wear pattern all the way through. And it all propagates, right? It all goes through. So, and again, you can control that however you like. If you want to drop the opacity of that, maybe. I mean, again, you're the artist. You do what you need to do. So that's kind of the idea, right? So the handle has a lot kind of going on here. So what are we looking for when it comes to the scraper blade? Well, the blade, you have 3 elements here that I'm kind of looking for. The overall shape of this blue tint, getting the blue tint, the paint itself kind of splattered about, and the rust, right? Getting some kind of maybe some variation in the rust color and highlights and whatnot. That'd be kind of nice. The handle, I think you'll be spending the bulk of your time. So there's a front and a back. Each side is unique. The back has a serial, right? And the way the paint interacts with that is a little bit different than the hide logo. Kind of function with that. Or play with that, I should say. We've got paint splatter throughout the handle, so just kind of play around. I'm not looking for pixel perfect by any means. I don't need exact shapes or silhouettes to match at all. I'm just looking for a good level of paint that feels correct, right? Overall roughness variation throughout the handle, scratches and things like that. The side of the handle should have a line. Also consider these kind of elements, the bolts and the threading at the top here. How did those rust in relation? Getting those elements in there, I think you're going to be in a pretty good spot because that's basically what we're looking for. Don't be intimidated, right? One step at a time, one step at a time, I promise. All right. And then the pulley is going to be a lot of the kind of the same thing. So let's go ahead and discuss the pulley. That way we're not running pretty late tonight. Now the pulley has some very specific wear patterns. I'm going to actually walk you through the entire process to recreate this specific pattern, as well as how to produce like the chipped paint here and the text, right? So this text is kind of like a special case where it's kind of curved. But then you guys will be kind of on your own to troubleshoot a lot of the other areas, and then we'll see how you guys do. But again, before we move forward, any questions on any of the anchor systems or kind of the process for the scraper itself? I'd be more than happy to go over that again. Okay, all right, I'll move forward. Just to kind of give you an example, so I was rebuilding the I don't expect you guys to go to this level of detail, and this is still incomplete, but this is just a new example of using some of the newer techniques we've developed for the class. This is just kind of the blade in a more finished state. The handle is still a huge work in progress. Let's see if this loads here quickly. All right, let's just set this up while that loads. Chugga chugga. Maybe I crashed it. All right, next time. All right, so moving on, we need to, we're gonna go back to Maya and we're gonna talk about ID mats. So ID mats are a kind of a way to create quick selection masks within Painter, right? And it's not specific to Painter. You might have seen this before. So if you search for like ID mats, it's very common. They're used mostly in compositing packages as a means to, again, create selection masks. So usually we tend to use just bright saturated colors, but it is not limited to just saturated colors. You could use any color. As long as it's a solid color, we basically eyedrop that section to pull a selection. This is going to save us some time. So for instance, if we look at this pulley, actually better yet, let's just look at the actual reference itself. You'll see that the large portion, or the top portion of the pulley, is predominantly rust. So if I were to try and paint that area, I could do it, right? If I was just trying to paint a mask to say, hey, this area is just rust, or the inside of the pulley is just rust, right? Which it is. That's a bit more time consuming. Now, if you don't have like UV selection sets for that particular area, depending on how you UV'd it, all right, in this case, the top, I do not, because it's all connected. I'd have a really tough time doing that. And I could like maybe do a face selection, but I would still accidentally select certain faces from an extreme angle. So it's a balancing act, right? So this is where we can kind of leverage ID masks to make our life a little bit easier. So let's get this out of the way, and we'll go back to Maya real quick. Now, for this to work, again, we do need UVs, all right? So I'm going to duplicate this mesh, and I'm going to grab both of them and just kind of group them out here, all right? I'm going to name one pulley ID, and I'm going to name the other one pulley base. Now, it is critical that these objects overlap. So I'm going to move it, but when I'm done, I'm going to move it back, all right? If they do not overlap, you're going to run into issues. It's not going to work. The pulley base, all I'm going to do is simply subdivide this, just like what we did with the scraper blade. So I'm going to just go ahead and hit Shift, go to Smooth, go to my options, make sure it's at 2 subdivisions with preserve edge and corners, click Apply, and that particular object is done. We're going to go ahead and export this out. That's our base. Export selection. We'll go up a directory and create a new one for our pulley. And I'm going to name it scraper_base. It's important we keep this organized, right? All right, now I did subdivide this, but I kept the ID 1 in 1. This is going to make our process a little bit easier to manage. It's a lot harder to select specific faces when it's this dense than it is up here, right? So I'm just going to Control 1 to isolate this basically. Now, I want to basically, let me turn this off in the 3D view. I want to assign IDs to very specific areas. Where you do it is up to you. Artistically, usually it makes sense to do it where you want to kind of make selections, right? So, or where you want to assign. Sometimes you'll see it used as like material selections, like maybe specific areas are used, or like leather or gold or something like that, and you might like ID that specific area. I've seen that done, but in this case, we're just going to do the inside, this top area, the top lip, and the bottom. Where's that reference? The bottom down here. Okay, so let's do it. Now, if I were to like say grab a face and double click here, that selection is not going to go all the way around. If I were to go to maybe like an extreme angle here and like marquee it like that, and even if I kind of deselect these faces here, you can see the selection's close, but I still have to clean it up, right? So this is where we're going to use our UVs to our advantage. So remember, I can select faces by selecting UV shells. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to start hacking this UV shell up. I'm going to double click on this bevel, shift right click, cut, and I'm going to grab that shell. That's the entire top part of the pulley. Shift T to assign a new material, and I'm going to do a Lambert. And we're just going to give it a color. We're just going to give it red. Done. And let's name it red_ID. All right. One of them done. We're going to do the inside. All right. So again, this one's already kind of set up for us. It's already a UV shell. Shift T, Lambert, and we'll do yellow. Click OK. We'll do yellow ID. And we'll do the bottom. Same idea, I'm going to go ahead and cut this. So I'm going to cut it right around here. Cut, grab that shell, Shift T, Lambert, and we'll do, I don't know, magenta. And there's actually one more area we can do that might make your life a little bit easier. I don't think it actually is necessary. If you watch some of the older videos, we kind of talk about doing it here. I'm going to skip that for now. I don't think it's entirely necessary. I think there are better techniques that you can leverage from the previous weeks to kind of create that. So this should be sufficient. So let's go ahead. I'm going to remove my isolate select. I'm going to remove the transform. So I did not freeze my transforms, right? So now I can zero it out, and now they're stacked on top of each other. I'm going to select ID again, shift right click and smooth. 2 subdivisions, we need to make it identical, click apply. All right. Now the cool thing is, because the way the IDs or the way the materials are assigned, even though I subdivided it, all of it updated. So we have a nice clean ID mesh, okay? Let's export that out. File, export selection. Good thing I named this one scraper. Let's rename that. And we'll name this pulley ID. Just checking the questions real quick. All right, so we have both of these meshes exported. At this point, you could technically remove the ID. I would just hide it in case you need it for whatever reason. And now let's go back to Painter. All right, so I got to load that up again because I crashed it. It looks like a new version's out, so feel free to grab that. Usually Painter's pretty good about not corrupting your files, so I have no problems if you get the latest update. We'll go ahead and select. Now, which file you start with is important. So if we started with the pulley, let's, for instance, if we start with the pulley ID and we kind of started working away at this, you'll notice pretty quickly that there's going to be some problems. So by default, everything looks okay. I don't see any problems. If I look at my texture set list, though, you can see some problems immediately kind of popping up. So specific areas are now as different texture sets, because again, it's looking at the materials I've assigned to it. So I don't want to start with the ID. I want to start with the base model. So let's go ahead and load that back in. We'll start with the base instead of the ID. We'll set that to 2K. Looking good. Click OK. Don't save. Put that shelf back down here. And now if I look at my layers, my texture sets, everything looks good. One texture set. We'll name it pulley _ matte. And of course, let's bake our mesh maps as always. Now, I'm going to go ahead and uncheck ID for now. And there's a reason for that. I'm going to uncheck normal, and we're going to bake this at 2K. Let's just go ahead and bake. So it's going to generate all of these maps based off this mesh, right? The base mesh. But when we bake the ID, I want to base it off a different mesh. And we'll be able to do that. All right, so that's done. We're going to go back to our base, our bake mesh maps, and I'm going to disable all of them. I'm going to turn on ID, and now what I'm going to do is essentially load in this high definition mesh. Now that's kind of a misnomer. Both of them are the same resolution, but just notice what these icons, these little 4 exclamation marks do when I load in the other mesh. So I'm going to load in our ID. Notice how these icons have changed. So what these are going to do, they're going to bake these specific channels based off this mesh. So I didn't necessarily want to bake the ambient occlusion or thickness off this map. I could have, but there's no real need to. I just want the ID. there's one other change we need to make. If I click on ID, it's set to vertex color as far as the color space. We want to change that to material color. All right. So if you make all of these changes and you bake your mesh map, you'll know you're correct when this shows up, the colored map. If it shows up black, you made a mistake. Either the meshes don't overlap perfectly, or the way you've brought it in and baked it, it's probably set to vertex color instead of material color. Now, if I kind of cycle through that, if I hit B, I can look through my mesh maps. There's my ID, right? Exciting. So this is how this thing works. So if I assign a new fill layer and I create a black mask, let's just make this like bright, obnoxious red. Since it's black, we don't see it. But if I were to add a color selection, I can now define, so right now the output value is white with a hardness of 1 and a 0.1 tolerance. If I just click pick colors, you'll see it change. I can add the areas where I want this to affect or potentially remove. I can change the color, right? If I pick multiple colors, like say red and yellow, you can see my mask is now updating for those two areas. So I can just use this as a quick way to select specific areas to do certain things. Make sense? All right. I'm not going to use this right now, but just know we can leverage this however you want. So whether you use it or not, you don't necessarily need to use it, but you could. I will be using it. So I'm going to build this just like we did with the scraper. 2 core materials. We have like a chipped paint, just the paint in general, and some rust. So let's just start with the rust base. Rust fine, drop that on there. We'll group it, we'll call it rust, a rust group. And we'll do the same thing, we'll color pick it, right? Might as well. Get something around there, maybe make it a little bit darker. And then let's do some paint. We'll do the same paint, that steel paint. Drag on top, and we'll group it. And let's color pick this. We get something like that. So here's what I want you to avoid doing. So if we see a submission like this, all right, black mask, add generator, metal edge wear. Now this is going to look wrong by default, but if let's say you inverted it and you cranked up that wear level and you're like, great, I'm done, cool. Or maybe you took it a step further and you're like, okay, hold on, let me just remove some areas so I can use that color ID and subtract this and subtract this area. Hey, look, I matched the reference. I'm going to be like, nope, sorry, you're not even close. We're looking for a lot more complexity, right? We have to go above and beyond metal edge wear, right? What separates you from another artist who's just downloaded Painter? Hopefully it's more than one metal edge wear, right? So your ability to recreate reference is what's going to separate you from Joe Schmo who just downloaded this yesterday, right? And don't think they're not capable of doing this, right? Every tutorial online will show them how to do a metal edge wear. So let's see how we can take this a bit further. Instead of doing it this way, I'm going to basically build this in such a way that we break up areas as separate sections. So kind of like what we did with the blade and the handle, except this is kind of one cohesive object. I'm not going to break it up in areas like the cogs or the bottom of the pulley or the top of the pulley or the inside of the pulley. We can do that, and I'm going to use anchors to do that. So once I build these sections, so for instance, let's do this. I'm going to create a fill layer and I'm going to drag it to the bottom. I'm going to call this anchor or just anchor, whatever, right? And we'll group this and we'll just call this anchor group. All right. And again, I don't need this to do anything in particular. So I'm just going to turn off all the material properties. I'll create a black mask and I'm going to essentially add a metal edge wear. So let's do it. Metal edge wear. And we get something like this, right? So if we think about this and I anchor this, I can now do something with that, right? This edge wear has just been created. I can put this anywhere. So if I go back up to my paint group, if I think about this, white is what I want to be rust. So I want to subtract that from the result. So if I bring it up, black mask, add a fill, drop in my anchor, it's working. All I need to do is simply invert it, right? And so any changes I make down here will propagate, right? But this is where it gets better. We can isolate this to specific areas. We don't necessarily, again, this is still kind of a global change. What if I had, for instance, a paint layer of just the cogs, right? So I'm going to put this down below the metal edgeware, and I'm going to select the UVs and make it white. So if I click on this mask, click, I'm going to turn off the metal edgeware so you can better see this. I'm going to marquee all of that. Actually, let's undo that. Let's just do it in the 2D view because I got the center. So I'm doing a UV selection on the outside cogs, okay? Now, if I look at this, you can see paint is being added since I've inverted it, right? Paint is being added to everywhere but that area. But now if I add this, it's not quite working, right? It's all, the metal edgeware just goes on top. So let me get back to my 3D view here. The metal edgeware is over top, but if I change my blend mode to say like multiply, this is where the magic really begins to happen. Now I have that metal edgeware only happening in these specific areas, right? So now what I want to be able to do is start adding this result back into the final result up here. Now, this is kind of freaking out. It's just the math I have set up right now, but this is the idea. We're going to isolate specific areas in the anchor system, pipe the result back into the paint group, and start adding each piece by piece back together. All right. So let's just kind of rework that. So I'm going to get rid of all of this. All right. Remove mask. All right, so I'm just going to build that anchor system again, right? Let me go ahead and I'll clear this mask completely. So if I want to isolate the cogs, let's do it, right? So starting with a fill, black mask, add a paint, right? So again, I'm not doing anything with this particular material. I'm just working on the mask. So I'm just going to isolate it by option clicking on that. We'll go back to our 2D, 3D view. UV selection, marquee this area, and now I have the teeth highlighted, right? Cool. So let's take it a step further. So if I go and I add, let's say, I want to isolate just either the teeth on the outside or the inside, we have the ability to kind of do that as well. So we've kind of marqueed this area already, but now we want to further isolate that selection. So let's do that. There is a generator we can use here to help us with that. It's called distance, 3D distance. Now this one's kind of cool. If you look at it, it's kind of like a three-dimensional sphere. Let me just up the contrast here. If you look closely, just imagine this as a three-dimensional sphere just moving through your shot, right? So we can use this to our advantage to isolate specific areas. So if I increase that radius, you can see I'm starting to kind of grab that inner ring. I'll up the contrast quite a bit and maybe up that radius, lower the position. And you can see I'm really starting to get that area. Now I'm still getting some value in there. So if I up that contrast to 0.99, I've clipped out the outer cogs. Now I have a selection for the inner cogs, but now I have this area visible, right? So I don't want that. I just want the inner cogs. So again, if we think about this mathematically, if I multiply this result down, anything that's already black below it stays black. Anything that's white receives the result above it. So let's multiply. Now we get something like this. Okay, let's take this even further. Let's add the generator to this and do our metal edgeware. I'll invert it. So if you think about this, if we're taking it up, right, if we're taking this, we want white. White is where the paint will be visible. So we want it predominantly white. So if we look at the teeth here, where it pushes back, it's mostly paint, and then on the teeth that push out, it's mostly rust. So we're working on the teeth that recede in. But again, the generator is overriding everything. So what do? Let's multiply it down. So it's only affected in those areas that were white below it. So again, work it backwards. How did we do this? How did we get to this point? We UV selected the cogs. We used the distance generator to isolate the center cogs. And now I'm just applying the generator on top of that existing selection. So I can kind of play with this. Wear contrast, bring that up a little bit, and get something like that. And again, I haven't done anything, right? This is all within the mask. So let's anchor it. Add an anchor. And I will go ahead and make sure I name this. So I'll say this is inner cogs. And let's go back to our paint group here. So I'm going to add a black mask, and I'm going to add a fill layer, and I'm going to drop that inner cog. There it is. The paint is slowly being added back in. But this is going to give me a lot of fidelity, a lot of control. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this entire. We'll name this whole thing inner cogs. Copy, paste. We'll call this one outer cogs. Rename the anchor, outer cogs. And if we look at this one, I'm going to option click on this mask. If we want the effect to happen on the outer cogs, if we think about this, we've already isolated to the cogs. This is that 3D distance, but it was grabbing the inner selection. What if I inverted my 3D distance? Let's try it. Invert. Now I have the outer cogs. And now I can push this metal edge wear even further, right? Because it's really worn in those areas. Now if I hit M, again, no change, but let's go ahead and add it back. So I'll add another fill up top. There's my outer cogs. Now, because of the blend modes, you can see that one is now covering everything. We don't see it. We have to add them together. So I'm just going to do a max lighten. So now we're getting very specific control across all the teeth. But now I'm not having to sit there and hand paint every single tooth individually, right? That would be insane. I now have individual control with different metal edge wears to kind of do what I need to do. I could take this even further. If we really kind of study this, you'll see there's more wear on the center than there is on the outsides, right? Like here. So we can do that. If I go back down here to my outer cogs, I'll add a fill. This anchor is going to constantly update, right? Now I can add something like another grunge map. Let's get this out of the way. There's a grunge here that actually ends up working really well for this specific scenario. And it's actually called Grunge Map 003. You wouldn't expect it, but you see that kind of black range in the middle? It actually works really well for what I want to do. I'm going to plug that into the grayscale. Now by default, it looks atrocious. Does not work. You're like, that was terrible. Yes, I would agree with you. If it would look like that, it would be terrible. But I'm going to change it from UV projection to triplanar. And the cool thing now is going to project that texture in a box, and I can kind of manipulate this. So if I scale this down, what I want to do is kind of like start to isolate this and get those black areas right in the middle. Right, so now I'm projecting that texture from all directions. And again, let's change our blend mode. Maybe we do a multiply. And now I can start wearing away more in those areas. And I can just adjust balance. I can decrease balance. I can play with the contrast and get very specific shapes. Right? And again, I'm not hand painting anything yet. And this is all updating automatically. It's just going through those anchors. Right? I can collapse all that. Look, it's my whole paint layer is made technically with 2 fill layers. But of course, it's all being generated down here. Any questions on that? Because we're going to keep going. There's more. All right, so we don't have to create everything down here in the anchor level. We can start building upon it from up here. So for instance, if I wanted to just maybe add the generator up here as well. So for instance, if I started with a, like if I want to get some paint in this area, let's do it. Let's just add a fill, and I'm going to set it to white. And because of our blend modes, we have to make sure we add them. Actually, let me, let's do this a little bit differently. I'm trying to think of the most elegant way to do this so I don't get too confusing. Yeah, so we'll add that fill. We'll just put it on top actually. And so it is going to cover, like if I set this to white, it is going to cover everything, right? And that's kind of a problem. So we have to kind of think about how we're going to add these all back together correctly. So if you want, no, this is still a terrible idea. I don't like this solution. Yeah, I'm gonna back out of that before it gets too weird. So again, really all it should be is just kind of adding these layers back in and to get that final result. So and then you'll kind of slowly progress to these areas. Now, again, it shouldn't take you too long. I promise you that. So let me actually, here we go. We'll do, this is simpler. Don't do the fill layer. If you do the paint layer, this is how we can kind of do it. So if we grab essentially these areas like so, and let me grab it. There we go. We can still maintain our selection here. I was overcomplicating. I'm sorry about that. And we can still add our generators on top of this, but the problem is it's going to blend in. So if I add my generator and do like a metal edge wear, keep in mind this will be on top, right? So if I invert this, we get something like this. So I kind of like the way this looks on this particular edge, but I want to keep these details. So what I can do is just kind of move this down and maybe have these set to a, or I could even just remove it from those particular areas. So take a look at this. So we're going to backtrack a little. All right. I've got the metal edge wear, and I'm going to add a paint layer, and I'm going to say this is cog removal. This is going to get really weird. All right. I'm going to remove the cogs from the selection. So I'm going to paint black on the mask. Just marquee that area. But here's where I add them back. So right now, fill layer is the inner cogs, or this is the inner and outer. If I add them back like this, so the idea is this. I do my metal edge wear to get the overall look on these top and bottom areas, but the cogs I wasn't happy with, right? So I remove it. I create it down in the anchors, and then I add it back in using the anchor system. This paint layer is no longer needed. I can just get rid of that. Instead, I can now use my color selection to now remove these areas, that, and that, right? So those can give me starting points. So now you can see we're actually getting pretty close to almost kind of like a final product. Now this isn't close to the final product, but I think you get the idea, right? Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. So with that metal edge where it is covering the whole thing, I did invert it. Then I get it, I remove the cogs, then I add them back in. So let's go ahead and move forward. One thing I want to talk about is, or at least the last two things we'll kind of talk about, is the chipped paint that we see here and the actual the lettering, how we can kind of produce that as well. So now the best way, in my opinion, to kind of create this effect is to simply pull it straight from the texture. So I'm going to go back to Photoshop. Now I've saved this image to my desktop. At least I think I did. Nope, I deleted it. It's gone. We can still get it back. So I'm going to look for the image with the chipped paint. So this one, right, this is the top. And since I have it selected, I can do, I believe it's under image, selection. Let's see. I want to save it out. Save, export, select images. Here we go. All right. Now you could download this from Google Photos as well. So essentially what I'm going to get is that image on my desktop. Now if I open it, there it is. So this is 100% resolution. Now the cool thing here is I can pull a selection mask based off this color range, right? So because there's a lot of contrast between the rust and the paint, we can use that to our advantage. So if I look at the channels here, this is important. So if I can compare channels, I want to find a channel that has the most contrast. So this is the red channel, this is the green, and this is the blue. So if we look at this, the red channel doesn't have a lot of contrast. It's quite subtle. The green channel, not too bad, but that blue channel, that's pretty good right there, right? There's a lot of contrast in that blue channel. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create an alpha. I'm going to go back to my blue channel. I'm going to Command A, Command C, click on the alpha, Command V. I don't know why it's this complicated, but it is. We go back to our layers and hit Command, just create a new layer and hit Command V again. So I'm essentially pasting that blue channel, right? So now we can edit this. I'm going to do another levels adjustment layer, levels, and I'm going to try and push this contrast as much as I can. I want to get these areas white and everything else black. So we'll raise the black point first, and then let's lower that white point. So now we have a nice high contrast mask. Now again, we don't want to like crank that up. It's going to get very harsh. So probably around there. And I'm not too worried about the rest of the image, all of this, because we're not going to paint that in. We're going to use stencils to kind of recreate this. Right? So let's go ahead and save this out. Throw it on our desktop here. Painter. Pulley. Excellent. We'll do this as pulley mask. And let's bring it in. All right, so we'll import that resource, add resource. There's our pulley mask. We'll do it as either texture or alpha, and import current session. All right, let's go to our top view here, so 2D only. And this is the top over here for me. Yours might be elsewhere. And I'm just going to add a paint layer to the paint. We'll just call it chipped paint. And just like before, grab our paintbrush, scroll down, plug in the stencil. So this to me is a really nice way to do it, right? What better way to match the reference than to actually be the reference, right? Now we can sit here and try and get this to be perfect, but I'm not too worried about it. Just kind of paint in the chipped paint where it kind of belongs. We'll say right about there. This one's right around here. And then we have some kind of paint over here. I'm not worried about the exact position of that paint at all. If you can get some chip paint in there, I will be happy. All right, let's remove that stencil. Go back to our 3D view. And we get something like that. Not too shabby. Right? And it looks like the reference because it is a reference, right? All right, let's talk about the text, and then I'll show you one additional thing that might be beneficial for you guys that you're welcome to take advantage of. The text is a little bit trickier. So if we use the text, excuse me, you could use the text tool, the font tool. The problem is the text is rotated. So if we look at this, we'd have to type in each individual letter, rotate it, stamp it, rotate it, stamp it. Now you could do that. That's not really a problem. But what I'm going to do is simply just export out the UVs. So I'm going to take my base UV mesh here and just do a UV snapshot. This thing we haven't used yet, but I made you create it. We're actually going to use. So throw that on the desktop. So I'm just doing a 2K PNG. Again, we'll go back to Photoshop and we'll open that up. Lovely. I threw it somewhere. I don't even know. Apparently, it's just not appending my PNG. There it is. All right, so we'll just make the background black, and I'll put that behind that guy. So the idea is we kind of know this area is the top. So what I want to do is use the type tool to kind of match that perspective. So what I'll do is just kind of eyeball this, see if we can see the text a little bit better. So this one says TL, or just type it out, TL28, the L050, and then the one square shape A2. So we'll do something like that, right? And then I'll just make sure this is kind of white. And the idea here is I'm going to use this kind of bend tool to basically warp it. So if we set it to arc, we can kind of bend it. Now 50% is going to be quite a bit of bend. I think it's somewhere around, I guess your UVs will modify it, so either 20% or 22%. So now I can kind of just position this where I need to. And if I wanted to rotate it, I can do that as well. So we'll say somewhere around here. I got pretty close on that. I think I'll bend it a little bit more. So you're not locked in, so just go back to your type tool and just bend it just a bit more. Good enough. And if you want to do the square, we can just do we can do that pretty easily. We'll just grab a square here, do an edit. Let me actually create this on a new layer here. Do an edit and stroke. Do white 3 pixels or something like that, and then just take the brush tool and stamp it somewhere in the middle, a little bit smaller. And we can take that, scale it down, and bring it over there as well. And we'll disable the UVs. So we get something like that. Did it not bring my whole square? Lovely. Love that. That looks good. I'll roll with that. That's fine. This is not going to even show up. So this text lands specifically where it lands in UV space. So if we save this out, as a PNG, put that in an online painter project, and call this polytext mask. And we'll go back into Painter and bring that in. Alpha, current session, import. And same idea, we could just simply, like if we wanted to adjust the height on the rust, I would actually say it's best to do this as an anchor. That's going to give you the most control. So again, if I went down here and created like a fill layer, brought into the anchors, turned off everything, and created our black mask, loaded in the texture here. Oops, that's our fill. Let's load that in. So if we option click on it, you can see exactly where that kind of lands in 3D space. We might need that to bend a little bit more. We'll see. And then we anchor this. And then we can just go up to like the rust, add a fill, just do nothing but height. Oops, I messed up. Create a new fill. And load in the anchor. There's our text. You can see that's loading. Now, that paint interaction, that could be an interesting kind of thing to add. It does interact with the paint in some way. It'd be great to see the paint kind of build up into that. So let's see if we can kind of do that. I'll turn the color off, rough, metal, normal, keep the height, and just kind of push it in. We get something like that. There you go. Now you got your cereal on there. And then one final thing. So if we wanted to do something like, say, dirt, we could do that as well. Now this is kind of a clever workaround. So I would just show you, if I use something like concrete as like a dirt base maybe. Again, just because of the material properties here, I'm just going to drag and drop concrete on there. Let's try a different one here. Yeah, that could work. I kind of like that. So we'll make this a bit darker though. And what I'm going to do is create a black mask, and I'm going to add a fill to kind of control where this goes. Now, if I go to my project, we have our ambient occlusion, and I can actually drag and drop that into there. So what it's going to use is that occlusion as a mask. So it looks like that. So that clearly doesn't look very good just yet, but if I hit it with like a levels and I inverted it, I can have the dirt build up in those areas of the cracks. So let me just make this a bit more obvious where that's kind of showing up by making it really intense. So you can see that's where it's kind of building up. So it's building up in all the cracks and things like that. But now I can adjust the levels accordingly to kind of tighten it up. So if I want more, if I want less, I can even blend textures on top of it. So if I added like a fill layer and maybe some type of grunge, I'm just going to pick grunge at random, maybe subtract it. That's going to create some additional breakup. So here's like before and after. And of course, I wouldn't, you could probably even multiply this color down. I think that'd be the best result instead of like just a normal color on top. Just find some darker color. You just get a little bit of dirt wear that way. So again, before, after, just kind of building up in the cracks there. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys tonight. I know it's a lot of information, especially if you were not comfortable with anchors. I know you guys are still kind of getting into Painter, but I really think you guys are more than capable of doing this. It's just going to take some time, probably more than you estimate, to kind of get these done. The export process is identical, so all you would have to do is export it, assign the material. So all you have to do is just focus on these two objects for the rest of the week, and that's it. Any questions on any of that? Yeah, have some fun with this. We are, again, grading you. Again, let me just make sure you guys are, for the pulley, here's kind of what we're looking for. So you have the chip paint on the front, I'm sorry, the top and the bottom, right? So we do want to concern ourselves with the bottom. And I'm looking for like the overall material quality feel. Like, you know, you should be within this realm of believability. The text, the serial should be on there. The chip paint, I did mention. There's this ring that kind of goes around too, right? Getting like that detail, I think, will be important. A little bit of roughness variation, very similar to the scraper itself. How we kind of did that would be perfect. But for the bulk of it, we did kind of do it together. So like this is key, making sure you're able to get that, I think will be the most important bit. All right, well, if there's no further questions, I'll go ahead and end the recording. If you're welcome to hang out, and if you have something more specific to the assignments.